Hey everybody, in this lecture we're going to start talking about Benjamin Franklin's early life, his family, his education, and some of his early prospects for employment. So let's get into it. Franklin was born in 1706 in Boston, Massachusetts. He came from a very big family, 17 children altogether. His father Josiah would remarry after his first wife passed away. And this second wife, Abigail Folger, would be Benjamin Franklin's mother. He was one of the youngest children in the family. It's around the age of 8 where things become interesting with Benjamin Franklin, at least as far as we're concerned. At 8 years old, Franklin's father enrolled him into grammar school. These days, we have a lot of ways to describe early education. Elementary school, primary school, grammar school. But in Franklin's time, grammar school was a very specific type of grammar school. It was, in fact, a kind of school where you focused on grammar. Latin grammar, Greek grammar, sometimes Hebrew grammar, where you would learn to read these languages. Why would an 8-year-old need to start learning to read these languages? Grammar school was a school you sent your son if you hoped that that boy would go on to become a minister. This was the beginning of training for somebody to become a minister. The Franklins were Presbyterians, kind of mainline Christianity at the time. And Franklin was the youngest of the boys in the family, and none of the boys had become ministers. And this was somewhat embarrassing for the family to have so many boys and none of them become ministers. And so little Ben was the last of the boys in the family, and his father decided, well, we better try and make this kid a minister. In fact, there were 10 boys altogether in the family. And Franklin makes a joke, Benjamin makes a joke in the autobiography about the fact his father wanted him to become a minister. Franklin tells us that his father tithed him to the church. It's a funny joke if you know specifically what a tithe is. A tithe is an offering to the church. Traditionally, a tithe is a 10% offering to the church. There were 10 boys in the family. Franklin was 10% of the boys in the family. Ben was the 10% offering to the church. It's a funny joke if you understand what a tithe is. And so Franklin was going to become a minister. And Franklin tells us he did very well in school, moved up to the front of the classroom. Franklin, as we'll talk a lot about, was very smart. In fact, he tells us he never remembers a time in his life when he could not read. Franklin already knew how to read before his father placed him into this school. So he was already literate when he got there. Franklin said he did very well. But after 1 year in grammar school, his father took him out. Franklin says, well, it was going to be expensive for Ben to become a minister. It would not only require specialized schooling at grammar school, but eventually to go on to college to become a minister. In Boston, that would have meant going to Harvard. Harvard was specifically created to train, at the time, Puritan ministers. Presbyterianism and Puritanism were very similar. Not a big difference as far as we're concerned. And so the plan would have been to go off to Harvard eventually. And Franklin in the autobiography tells us that his father realized this was going to be expensive and took him out of grammar school. Personally, I suspect there's something else going on. His dad wanted Ben to be a minister. But as we'll talk about as we go on, one of the things we'll notice, particularly about Benjamin Franklin's early life and his teenage years, was Ben was a very strange child and strange teenager. He was weird. In a lot of ways, we might describe him as a nerd. He was very bookish. He read a lot. And he got a lot of ideas that he followed through from these books. We're going to talk about some of them later in this lecture. And Ben never seemed to be self-conscious when he would try some unusual idea. It would just seem to make sense, and he would do it. Ben was a nerd. And we're talking about a time, the 18th century, where if you were going to become a minister, you not only needed a lot of education and obviously faith in God, but you had to be kind of conventional in a lot of your other ways and a lot of your other thinking. And I think as much as Josiah, his father, wanted him to become a minister, he looked at this 8-year-old, 9-year-old boy after a year in grammar school and just thought, this kid's kind of weird. And I'm going to send him to grammar school, and then later on I'll try and send him to Harvard. And he's not going to become a minister because he's just kind of weird. Okay. I think that's what was going on. After all, his father knew when he first enrolled him in grammar school that it was going to be expensive. What changed after a year about that? What I think changed is his father's optimism about the prospects of Ben actually becoming a minister. I think his father realized, I'm just going to waste this money, and this kid's not going to become a minister. Well, I really want you to notice that about Benjamin Franklin. To most of you, what you knew about Benjamin Franklin was Ben was a founding father. He was a revolutionary. And because of that, it sort of normalizes Benjamin Franklin to us. But when you read his early life story, you realize, like, wow, this dude was really weird. He had a lot of really weird ideas. And if you try to imagine, like, I don't know what's going to happen to this boy later on in life. Like, pretend you didn't know he was going to be a revolutionary. Pretend you didn't know he was going to become a founding father. If you're just reading about this kid, he's kind of strange. All right? And I want you to kind of appreciate that. Ben was a weird nerd. All right? And so after taking him out of grammar school, Benjamin Franklin's father enrolls him in a traditional, what would have been known as a reading and arithmetic school. This was a normal school that you would send your child to if you were a farmer or a tradesman and you thought your child was going to follow up in those kinds of footsteps. No more learning fancy Latin or Greek grammar. This is where you learn to read and write basic arithmetic that you would need to survive as a farmer or a tradesman. Okay. Franklin would go to this school for 2 years, and then he was done with school. It's really interesting. Benjamin Franklin only had 3 years of formal education. That was it. So at 10 years old, Franklin was done with school. Okay. His father, Josiah, he was a soap and candle maker, what was known as a chandler. He had a respectable business in Boston, and one of Ben's older brothers had served as an apprentice to his father and had actually gone off and gone to a different colony to start his own soap and candle shop. His father was without an apprentice, and so Ben was done with his formal education. He's 10 years old. And so Ben's father decides young Benjamin will become an apprentice at the soap and candle shop. And Ben worked for his father for 2 years in the soap and candle shop and pretty much hated every minute of it. He just didn't like the prospects of being a soap and candle maker for the rest of his life. In fact, towards the end of that second year, it was becoming so apparent that Ben was unhappy that his father decided to look for something else for his son to do. What really worried his father was that Ben was spending more and more time with his friends sailing. They'd get a little boat and they'd go out in rivers and do things along those lines. And Ben's father was afraid that Ben was so unhappy, he was just going to join the crew of a ship and become a sailor. And his father didn't want him to do that. So Ben says around the age of 12, his father started taking him on long walks around the city of Boston, observing what various people did for a living. Talk to them, observing what they did. They'd go see blacksmiths and masons and carpenters. Ben tells us in the autobiography that this was actually very advantageous for him later in life. Ben said he learned a lot from this about how people did things. As we'll talk about more later, Benjamin Franklin becomes a really important inventor and a kind of jack of all trades. Franklin had a tremendous broad base of knowledge that he could apply in lots of applications. And the impression we get from reading this is Franklin sort of is hinting that some of his abilities started here, where he learned how different people did different things. And part of what he's implying to us, the reader, is that we should be curious. We should have an open mind. We should be interested in things. As Ben took these long walks with his father around the city of Boston, observing how different people did different things, he learned a lot. And none of which was immediately applicable in his life. It was only later on that he realized, oh, I know how to do this, because of these walks with his father. And so we should have an open mind. We should be curious about how things work in this world. Well, the good news for Ben is he had 9 older brothers. And if you have 9 older brothers, chances are you have a lot of older brothers that do different things. And Ben had an older brother, James. And James owned a printing shop. And Ben and his father decide that's what Ben should do. He should work as an apprentice to his older brother, James. And so at the age of 12, Ben becomes an apprentice to his brother, James, at the printing house. Now, let's be clear about something. An apprenticeship was a legally binding contract. Okay, don't think of it as a part-time job. Don't think of it as an internship. It was a legally binding contract in which the apprentice agreed to work for free for the master until the age of 21. Actually, that last year, the apprentice got paid. But prior to that, you worked for free. This is the only way you could really learn a skill or a trade in those days. You know, a printer like James wasn't going to teach somebody for free how to become a printer for fear that that printer might become competition. Right? And so the way the apprenticeship worked is, okay, I'll teach you how to be a printer, but you're going to work for me for a long time for free. And then the understanding was, after you were done with your apprenticeship, you would set up your business somewhere far enough away that you wouldn't serve as competition to the master. That was kind of that's one of the reasons why Ben's brother that served as a chandler to his father moved to a different colony. He didn't want to be competition to his father and his soap and candle shop in Boston. So I wanted to emphasize the legal nature of this apprenticeship, get you to understand this, because later on, Ben is going to break his apprenticeship. And I want you to understand that that's a big deal when he does, when we get there. Well, Ben takes to his new role as an apprentice in a printing shop very well. Ben was a kind of voracious reader from the earliest of age. tells us he never remembers a time in his life where he didn't know how to read. He loved to read. And in the 17th century, unless you were rich, getting a hold of reading materials was a challenge. Books were very expensive at this time, and there were not free lending libraries available at this time. There were libraries, but they were private. And so if you were a bookish kid like Benjamin Franklin, getting your hands on reading material could really be a challenge. But if you worked in a printing house, you would have access to lots of things to read. And so this is part of what attracted Ben to working in his brother's printing house. He would get stuff to read, and not only stuff to read, but also be surrounded by literate people that would come in to want to get things printed. It was a very attractive environment, like a musician working in a music store, or a skateboarder working in a skate shop. You had interest in the products and services that the business offered. But it went beyond that. Not only was Ben bookish and he liked to read, but again, as we'll talk about more, Ben was also very mechanically inclined. He was going to be very good with the printing equipment. Again, in the 18th century, printing equipment was advanced engineering. And Ben liked the equipment. It turns out he was going to be very good at operating it and repairing it and modifying it. He liked that almost engineering aspect of printing. So this was a perfect line of work for Ben, both in terms of his interest and his aptitude. He was well suited to this. And in fact, Ben is going to go on and become a successful printer, as we'll talk about later on. So from an early age, Ben knew that this was going to be what he was going to do. All right. Now, let's talk about something that is revealing about Ben in a lot of ways. I told you before that Ben was a nerdish, sort of bookish kid. Read a lot of everything he could get his hands on. And what's interesting about Ben is when he would find something in a book that made sense to him, he would do it. He would follow through on what's always seemed to be reasonable to him. Right? And so one day he was reading a book by a Roman author, Tyron. And Tyron was a vegetarian, what he referred to as the vegetable diet. Now, please don't get confused. When Franklin in the autobiography talks about the vegetable diet, he's just talking about what you and I would consider vegetarianism. The vegetable diet is not exclusively eating vegetables. It's just not eating meat. Ben could eat bread, he could eat nuts. He didn't just eat vegetables. Sometimes students get confused, and when they write on stuff for me, they assume the vegetable diet means only eating vegetables. No, it just means vegetarianism. He could eat anything that didn't have a parent. All right? Simple enough. And so Ben was reading Tyron talking about the vegetable diet, vegetarianism, and it made sense to Ben. He liked it. This was around the age of 15. And so Ben decided to become a vegetarian. But what's interesting for us about this is, one, it's an example, and we're going to talk more about this as we go. Franklin's going to start a lot of stories, particularly in part 1 of the autobiography, with, one day I was reading a book, and in this book, it talked about such and such. And I thought such and such was a good idea, so I started doing such and such. In this case, vegetarianism. Okay. But it's also, one of the things that's interesting about it is what exactly attracted Ben to the vegetable diet. On the one hand, These days, when we think of vegetarianism, we often think about it in terms of a moral or ethical decision, that people become vegetarians because they don't want to kill animals to sustain their own life. Right? And there was definitely a dimension of that, as Ben acknowledges in the autobiography. He liked the idea of living without killing animals. That was a nice idea to him. But there was a whole different reason, one we tend not to think of today because it's not as relevant today, but was very relevant in Ben's time. The vegetable diet in the 18th century would also save you a lot of money. See, in Franklin's time, a sort of urban dweller in a place like Boston, in other words, not a farmer, their single biggest expense for a typical poor or working class or middle class family, their biggest expense often was food. Food was very expensive. They didn't have modern farming. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have, well, at least a lot of the preservatives we have today. It was difficult to get food from farm to the table. It was very expensive. Okay? Today, food is very inexpensive by historical standards today. Okay? In Franklin's time, housing was much cheaper than today. Today, housing is very expensive, and food is rather inexpensive. Those things have flip-flopped. Right? And so when Franklin was reading Chiron, and he's reading about this vegetable diet and how you could live without eating meat, and of all the foods that were the most expensive, meat was the most expensive. It's the most perishable in most cases. And so meat was really expensive in Franklin's time. And so he's reading about this vegetable diet. And he's thinking about, wow, I could really save a lot of money if I became a vegetarian. And as we will talk about, saving money is going to become one of Benjamin Franklin's big virtues in life. Right? One of his big virtues in life. And so what attracted Ben to the vegetable diet was not simply the moral or ethical dimension, which we would understand today because you either are a vegetarian, I'm sure you know vegetarians, and this is the reason we usually associate why they did it. They didn't want to kill animals to eat. But for Franklin, there was a whole nother consideration, and that was you could save a lot of money. Now, this was not an immediate issue for Ben because Ben was an apprentice. Now, at the age of 12, when Ben became an apprentice to his brother James, he actually went to go live with James. And James gave him a place to live and provided every meal for Ben. And so it wasn't an issue in the beginning. Well, it did kind of become an issue because Ben started to annoy James by insisting that his meals be vegetarian. Yeah. But later on, when Franklin was going to have to pay for himself, this vegetable diet was going to come in very handy. He's going to tell us that he saved a lot of money by living this frugal lifestyle of not eating meat. In fact, as time goes on, Ben and James start to fight more and more. I'm always kind of sympathetic to James. Could you imagine having this genius younger brother, Benjamin Franklin, as your younger sibling? One of the things you'll notice in part one, mostly in part one, but every time Ben is working under another person or under the authority of a person, there's always tension. Benjamin Franklin was a genius. He thought he knew better, and most of the time he probably did know better. It must have been hard for Ben to work for other people. I mean, let's not lose track of the fact that this is a guy who's going to become a revolutionary. It's interesting. We see some of those revolutionary characteristics early in his life. He seems to sort of chafe at the prospects of authority. He doesn't like working under other people. It was okay in the beginning because Ben was learning how to be a printer and he needed James. But by the time he gets to 15, 16 years old, he knows everything he needs to know at this point. He's picked up the printing game. And so Ben and James fight more. One of the things they fought over is what James thought was this ridiculous vegetable diet, that Ben wanted separate meals without meat. Well, it got so bad at a certain point, around the age of 16, Ben comes up with this idea. All made possible because of the vegetable diet. Ben goes to James and says, look, James, you and I were fighting too much. I'm in your hair and there's too much tension. I, Benjamin Franklin, have an idea, James. You take half of the money that you normally spend on me, housing me, feeding me, clothing me. You give me half of that money and I'll find my own accommodations. I'll pay for my own clothes. I'll pay for my own food. I'll show up to work every day. You won't lose any of my labor. But after the workday's done, I'll do my thing, you'll do your thing, and, there won't be as much tension. How does that sound? And also, you'll save money. James said, sounds great. Okay, let's do that. Ben tells us that all of this was possible because of the vegetable diet. In fact, not only could he live on half the money that James gave him, but he could actually save half of the money that James was giving him because he lived such a frugal way of life. Okay. Remember earlier I told you that in the autobiography, Franklin holds himself up as a kind of blueprint for us, the reader, to follow along with. Right? And this is one of those lessons that he wants us to copy. To be frugal, to save money. Okay? It doesn't do you any good, no matter how much money you make, if you go out and spend that money as fast as you make it. You have to save your money. Think of the freedom that Franklin gained by saving money, that the vegetable diet allowed him. Instead of living in this oppressive life with his brother 24 hours a day, because Ben saved money and was frugal, he could gain a degree of freedom. He could go out and live on his own. So rather than just spending every dime you get as fast as it comes in, Franklin is encouraging us to save money. Right? A penny saved is a penny earned. That's a Benjamin Franklin quote. All right? And again, notice Ben picked this up in a book. And also, I want you to pay attention to how weird this was for 18th century America, colonial America. There are a lot of parts of the world at this time where vegetarianism was quite common and not unusual at all. But colonial North America was not one of those places. This was really weird. I suspect some of you watching this video are vegetarians or vegans yourself. And you could acknowledge that even in 21st century cosmopolitan Southern California, you tell some people you're a vegetarian and sometimes people are like, oh, that's kind of weird. That's today. That's now. 18th century colonial America, that was really weird. And you'll notice in the autobiography, Franklin doesn't talk at all about how he was self-conscious of this or worried about it or, was anxious because he thought people might think he was weird. No. He just I read it in a book. It made sense. I did it. Franklin was very unusual, and he would follow through with his unusual ideas. It's interesting. All right. Now, if saving money was one of Benjamin Franklin's principal virtues, right next to it was working hard. And early in the autobiography, Franklin talks a lot about how he worked hard. Okay. One of the things he tells us a lot about early on is working on his writing. Okay. Now, Franklin became a famous writer in his age. Okay. In fact, in 1771, when Franklin starts writing Part 1, Franklin probably would have been mostly known as a writer, writing things like Poor Richard's Almanac at the time. Later on, after the American Revolution, that would overtake it. But despite him being known for a variety of things, being an inventor, being a printer, being heavy into politics, Franklin's early success had a lot to do with his ability to write. I would argue that if Franklin had not been able to write, most of his other success later in life would not have materialized. Now, Franklin knows that. Franklin knows as he sits down in 1771 to start writing about his memoir, like, people know me as a writer. And so he spends some time describing to us how he became a better writer. He talks about he would read magazine articles he could get his hands on, like The Spectator, and he would read the article and he would try to rewrite it. He would find articles and then read them, and then weeks later try and rewrite the article. He goes into a fair amount of detail talking about working on writing. Why? He doesn't want us, the reader, who knows him as a great writer, to just assume like, oh, writing was natural to me. Writing was always easy for me. Oh, the first time I put pen to paper, the words just flew. No, that's not the way it worked. How did Benjamin Franklin get good at writing? He worked really hard at writing. Writing is a craft. I sometimes hear students say, I'm not a very good writer. Well, I'll talk to them like, do you work on improving your writing? Okay. When do you finish your writing assignments? Right before they're due? Or do you try and finish them a few days early and edit them and give them to somebody else to edit, maybe even go to the writing center to get some help? You do those things? Well, okay. Well, no wonder you're not the best writer in the world. All right. Think of it this way. The greatest writers in the world use editors. All right. Newspaper reporters use editors. Magazine writers have editors. Okay, if all those people need editors, don't you think maybe your work could use a little editing? All right. And so Franklin wants us to understand how much he worked. All right. And so two of the things, particularly in Part 1 in the autobiography, that Franklin never gets tired of telling us about are hard work and saving. All right. Franklin thinks a lot of your problems in life will be solved if you really master these two virtues. Learn to work really hard. The harder you work, the better your prospects become. The more money that will start rolling in. And then you save that money. And you don't waste that money on trivial things. You save that money. And then that opens up new avenues and paths for you because you have new opportunities. All right. I'll talk about this a little bit more in our next lecture when I talk about the idea of equality and how Franklin relates the idea of equality in the autobiography. But that's a good place to stop here. In fact, that'll be the first thing we pick up on in the next lecture. Okay, everybody, take care.